Good morning or good afternoon. Thank you for joining Agendi's London Climate Action Week webinar. Looks like we've got an excellent turnout and we've got a lot to cover today. My name's Lena. I'm managing partner at Agendi, based in our London office. I've spent the last 2 decades supporting global organizations across core topics, including climate strategy, risk, decarbonisation, and of course, our topics for today, bringing all of that together into effective net zero strategies and transition plans. You'll see that I am joined by my 2 fabulous colleagues, Victoria, a manager within Agendi, and also Yin Mui, consultant, and both are coming with extensive decarbonisation strategy experience to share with all of you today. As I said, it's a pleasure to be here. We have the next hour to provide a practical walkthrough of the corporate net zero strategy playbook. We're going to cover standards, risks, opportunities, and transition plans. But before we begin, we are recording the session. We'll be sharing the content, sharing all of these slides, or essentially the playbook. No need to take notes, and we'll follow through with all of that in the follow-up. Brilliant. So as I said, a lot to cover. Let's get stuck in. Before I begin, I'll do a quick introduction of Agendi for those of you who are not familiar with us. Agendi is a specialist climate sustainability strategic consulting firm. We have offices in London, we're here in the UK in London, as well as Europe, the US, and we bring practical and forward-looking approach to our clients regarding sustainability. We work across all sectors with a focus on large listed global organizations. And we support across E, S, and G, and that brings forward strategy, target setting, quantification, transition planning, and increasingly compliance. We base our approach on knowledge sharing, capacity building, and we always bring full transparency to all of our calculations, models, deliverables, and hopefully you'll see an example of some of those as we go through today. And one of our key areas of expertise and the focus of today's session is transition planning. So let's dive into today's topic. Today, we want to leave you with 3 key things. First is clarity on the evolving landscape. And for those with a very keen eye, you will have seen there was an announcement for the UK sustainability reporting standards just 2 hours ago. We've managed to put in a little bit of content on that, but we'll be focusing within the UK, but also more broadly on a global level. And that's to match what we see from our clients, where they're falling under varying compliance landscapes throughout their areas of operation. We'll also leave you with an insight into effective transition planning and what separates a meaningful plan from a box-ticking exercise. So that's the importance of alignment of strategy, governance, and metrics. And finally, we're hoping to bring forward all of that towards practical implementation steps. As you'll see, I've got the contents up here. We're going to break that down first with a general context framing, why net zero matters, where momentum is shifting, and then we'll look at the changing standards and frameworks, what's new, what's coming. We've also got some major updates expected from SBTi and the Greenhouse Gas Protocol within the coming months and years. We'll also then take a very practical look at net zero strategy in action. We're going to be stepping through a net zero transition strategy roadmap. So we're going to carry through from maturity mapping, risk, resilience, pathway development, engagement, financial integration, and then progress tracking and reporting. And then we'll wrap up with key takeaways and Q&A. There is a Q&A box running along. Please do pop in your questions. We'll try and get to them as we go, and then hopefully leave time all the way at the end. And if we don't get to any, because we've got a lot of content today, we'll be sure to follow up with you after this webinar. One other important note, we are mindful that many of you are coming from organizations with quite a high level of maturity in terms of your approach to net zero and your strategy in relation to target setting, emissions quantification. On that basis, we have assumed a baseline understanding of key themes. So do reach out if you require support on some of the more foundational topics. We're more than happy to redirect you to some of our more foundational webinars as well. Brilliant. Let's begin. So if we start with the bigger picture, we are no longer in a theoretical or future-orientated conversation about climate change. The science is clear. Human-induced warming has now reached 1.22 degrees. And I've linked a very recent report in terms of the updated metrics on a global level, and we now only have just 130 gigatons of CO2 left in our carbon budget to stay within our limit of 1.5 degree warming. We've now crossed all but one of our safe planetary boundaries, and that means the natural systems that we rely on for clean air, safe food, drinkable water are becoming unstable. And yet, when we consider our global current policies, they're steering us well beyond our required 1.5 degrees. We're headed towards 2.7 degrees by the end of the century. This is far exceeding the goals and highlighting the need to fill that policy and action gap. And when we translate that into the business landscape, it's no longer just a scientific problem, but it also becomes a boardroom issue. And part of the problem is the level of interconnection between these potentially cascading impacts on society. So I've popped down an image there in terms of climate impacts and how that can cascade in terms of health and other indirect issues across society. And we have sustainability risks were once framed as a long-term or reputational. They're now driving real financial and operational impacts. The World Economic Forum now ranks 6 of the top 10 global risks at 10 years as sustainability related. And so whether it's access to capital, supply chain disruption, or the ability to attract and retain talent, climate is shaping the fundamentals of corporate risk. And climate risk is financial risk. And investors are pricing this in. Regulators are tightening the rules, and business continuity is increasingly depends on how prepared your organization is to both adapt and respond. But as we accelerate transition efforts, we also need to acknowledge the reality of headwinds and uncertainty, particularly political and economic. This year alone, we've seen growing political pushback, regulatory reversals, inconsistent policy signals, particularly in the EU. There were delays in terms of the UK Sustainability Requirements Standard, just released 2 hours ago. We'll cover that later. And then what we're seeing is net zero councils being relaunched, or potentially high-profile net zero targets quietly dropped. And all of this is pointing towards a very mixed picture. And for businesses, this presents a dual challenge. First, how do you maintain momentum when the policy landscape keeps shifting? And second, how do you build a transition strategy that is resilient, no matter who's in power in the next term? And the answer to that question lies in embedding resilience into your planning and treating transition not just as a compliance or disclosure requirement, but as a strategic capability. And that's what we're going to be focusing on across this webinar. One of the other elements, and it's often less considered, but it's a key cross-cutting element and absolutely central to delivering credible climate action, is the concept of a just transition. And at its core, a just transition is about fairness. It's making sure the shift to a low carbon economy supports those most affected without deepening any existing inequalities. And so whether we face a high emissions future associated with the physical impacts of climate, so heat stress, water stress, sea level rise, flooding, severe weather events, fires, all of those we're seeing presently, or potentially and hopefully a more optimistic future where we meet our global climate goals, we know this needs to come with very strong, potentially disruptive policies and the need for behavior change. And so either of these future scenarios, or more likely what will be a combination of these scenarios, is going to require businesses to plan to avoid these business impacts. Although in doing so, and rolling out a transition plan, it may potentially disrupt or exacerbate elements of fairness. So potentially creating a skills gap or talent loss as workers are displaced or left behind, potential pass-through costs, increased legal compliance requirements, resulting potential brand erosion, customer backlash, or impacts to growth affecting supply chains and communities. And this isn't theoretical. It's already playing out in various sectors and markets. So one of the themes we're going to be embedding throughout this presentation is whether your organization's transition plan is both future-proofed and fair. Now, moving on from the why to the how, which is the rest of our webinar that we'll focus on, we know the ambition is there. So net zero pledges, they're everywhere. But ambition alone isn't enough. Stakeholders, from investors to regulators to employees, they're now seeking credible delivery. And so what does credibility look like? We know it starts with structure. That means frameworks like SBTi, Transition Plan Task Force, ISSB, which likely the UK is going to endorse in the autumn. They're going to help define what good looks like, and Victoria is going to deep dive on the reporting landscape shortly. And good also requires coherence. Your strategy, your reporting, your governance, they all need to align. And we need to avoid these mixed signals or inconsistencies. Governance also plays a critical role, board-level ownership, clear lines of accountability, and integration across your business. And finally, we have to recognize this is a crowded and evolving landscape. What's right for one sector may not be for another. And we may see a net zero target or a commitment that stretches one organization, but is still achievable. But for another organization, it's simply out of reach. And how do we bring those together? Going to hand over now to Victoria, who's going to run through the regulatory landscape.
Thank you, Helena. Yes, so looking about this at the standards and frameworks into evolution and what is constantly happening in updating those frameworks and standards, we wanted to first give an overview, and I will go into more detail on several of those in the upcoming slides. I think very important is, of course, to know this is not just about compliance, it's also about understanding what credibility means in your context, for your company, in your sector, aligned with your ambition. And there's no single framework that does it all, meaning that we have to look at all of those, understand what is right for you, what mix is right for you. And as I said, those vary by sector. A lot of those have sector-specific frameworks and standards as well. So we aligned those into those 4 different brackets you see here in ambition, disclosure, transition planning, and assurance. When we look at ambition first, we see, of course, the SBTi, around for a longer time, the gold standard for target setting, near-term, long-term, and net zero targets, a recognized framework that also has sector-specific ones for financial institutions, for high-emitting sectors, and for SMEs as well. When we look at ISO at the moment has a net zero guidance published, but is in the process of converting this guidance into a full framework. And then we have the Net Zero Banking Alliance here. Of course, there are many more alliances for different sectors, but we wanted to pick here the Net Zero Banking Alliance as a bank-led but UN-backed alliance collaboration. It's member-led, it's a global initiative that supports banks to lead on climate mitigation in line with the goals of the Paris Agreement. However, there also have been some recent news about a lot of banks dropping out of the alliance, and most likely consequently, the banking alliance to drop the requirement to align financing with 1.5 degrees. So a lot of movements there as well. When we look at the disclosure bracket here, of course, we have various mandatory disclosures across different jurisdictions. We have the SECA reporting in the UK, which is the streamlined energy carbon reporting. We have CSRD and accompanying VSME, so SME standards for CSRD that are voluntary. Of course, those are under development under Omnibus. We have the ISSB, which is adopted already in several countries like Australia, made mandatory, kept voluntary in Canada, and now the UK just published their adoption draft for ISSB. We have CDP as a voluntary framework. Why we wanted to mention it here, because it's still the largest voluntary framework. It often prepares for the mandatory reporting. There are a lot of mapping activities to map, for example, the CDP questions to your ESRS disclosure under CSRD to make reporting on multiple frameworks slightly more streamlined. When we look at the transition planning, of course, we have the TPT framework from the Transition Plan Task Force, and we dive deeper into that in a moment. There are also sector-specific, or the TPT also has sector-specific standards on top, but there's purely sector-specific ones, for example, from the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. So those are for financial institutions. Also here we see some restructuring, some movements in the organizations, as I mentioned before, for the Net Zero Banking Alliance, because they're connected. The BSI and the ISO standards here also for financial services. And what we mentioned below in this bracket, the Integrity Council in the VCMI, which is the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiatives, are for credible carbon credits or carbon offset claims. Last but not least, we have assurance standards. There's the ISSA 5000 standard, which is for sustainability assurance in general, and it's from the IASB, which is the International Auditing and Assurance Standards Board. Here also the UK is currently looking into adopting this standard. There are several other assurance requirements under CSRD and CSRD. However, those are currently subject to omnibus, so to the simplification of the sustainability regulations in the EU. We wanted to pay a bit more attention to specific standards here, and I'm not going into too much detail, but we think it's a very useful slide to come back to see the differences in requirements for governance, target setting, transition plans, reporting, and the role of offsets, as there are, of course, different requirements for all of them. I want to mention just that for transition plans, for example, the ISSB does not have a concrete requirement that you have to create a transition plan as long as you can still comply with the reporting under the standards of IFRS S2. The CSRD, CSRD, there is for certain companies at the moment a requirement to have transition plans aligned with 1.5 degrees. This is one of the topics that is currently under heavy discussion with Omnibus, so that's something to watch if the requirement is going to stay or not. In SBTi, we, of course, and I go into even more detail in a moment because it's a new draft that is under consultation, which, and that is what I want to mention here, has now included in the draft the requirement to publish a transition plan. So previously, companies could set a net zero target, kind of potentially delay action on the reduction of the emissions to get to net zero. However, that's not the case anymore. Under the drafted rules, within 12 months, companies need to publish a transition plan. Moving on, showing that everything or a lot of those standards are all now under the board of the ISSB umbrella. And quickly to the news of today, just a few hours ago, the UK has published the long-awaited draft to the UK SRS S1 and SRS S2. So those are aligned with the IFRS standards S1 and S2. For S1, we have general requirements. S2 are climate-related disclosure, very closely aligned to the previous TCFD framework. We have listed here a few of the differences, the minor amendments for the UK application, because for the ISSB adoption, every country can choose to change the adoption slightly. So we mentioned them here. I think one of the big ones I want to touch on is the extended relief on climate-only transition to 2 years, whereas the ISSB requires only 1 year. That means that companies in year 1 disclose on climate-related risks and opportunities. So if you already fall under the UK CFD regulation, you're already most likely widely covered here. It really extends in year 3 when you have to report under S1, under more wider sustainability related risks and opportunities. So far to the just published drafts. We will of course go into more detail, publish more content about them, and are also happy to support anyone trying to understand those. Very quick here, transition plan. Of course, the transition plan task force is part of a regulatory update that will also be or is in the process of adoption into the UK. We will go into more detail, or when we have the chance to go into more detail in the draft to understand if those are already included in the published draft. What we see, or what you see here, is the outline of the TPT framework, which is considered the gold standard for transition planning. So the TPT focuses on setting ambitious and defining implementation, ambitions in defining implementation. It's also about the engagement across your value chain. Industry and government form a key theme here. The 3 guiding principles are ambition, action, and accountability that underpin the TPT framework, and they are organized under these 5 disclosure elements you can see here. Quickly moving on to the IFRS guidance. They published a guidance document to clarify the climate transition related disclosure items in IFRS S2. A very important note here, this is not a standard to show you how to create a transition plan. It's a guidance to support you to report under S2. So no additional requirements here. It's clarification of different terms, and it refers back to the TPT framework. Looking into all the developments, or a few developments we picked here that are ongoing across global markets and sectors, we see several consultations of the greenhouse gas protocol. So we can, and we will include more details in the follow-up because it's about several different guidance documents that are being updated currently. We have, of course, the target setting framework from SBTi that is currently updated, ISO that I mentioned before, and the other ones as well. And a quick highlight here on the SBTi corporate net zero standard, which just moved to pilot testing. The public consultation phase just concluded. I already mentioned the mandatory publicly available transition plan requirement here. Without developing a guidance here, but referring back to the TPT framework, a high level of governance here is required to approve the plan, and at least every 5 years it needs to be updated. Quick note to the greenhouse gas protocol. On the right-hand side here, the greenhouse gas protocol is, as I said, in the process of updating several standards, including the one on greenhouse gas accounting and reporting on the impacts of action and market-based instruments. A very long title here, but it clarifies, or is supposed to clarify, the actions and market instruments. So for example, when we look about the usage of sustainable aviation fuel. That will be included when we look at avoided emissions, or how it's also called scope 4 emissions. There will be details in there. The public consultation should begin in Q4 2025, so no draft available yet. So that concludes our session on frameworks. And as I said, there will be a bit more information in the follow-ups. We are also happy to answer any questions here because of the ever-changing landscape. Moving on to the transition and net zero in practice. So this is, as Helena already mentioned before, a roadmap or rough roadmap plan that we created to step you through. So we look at maturity mapping, ambition setting, and governance first, risks and opportunities second, defining low carbon pathways, stakeholder engagement, finance planning and alignment, and in the end, progress tracking and reporting. So looking at number 1 first.
Okay, we will now zoom in on the first core building block of transition planning, so maturity mapping and ambition setting. This is where we really set the tone for everything else that follows, because if your strategy is built on weak foundations, it can risk the whole transition from falling over. So every organization starts from a different place. Maturity mapping is about understanding where you are positioned. Are you currently doing bare minimum for compliance? Are you preparing for change? We see 2 different elements to maturity. There's maturity on action, and then there's maturity on disclosure. These are 2 distinct but related issues. Action looks at strategic integration of climate into your business operations, and then disclosure looks at regulatory and voluntary reporting maturity. But it's also important to note that part of action is transparent disclosure. So the key message is that ambition and disclosure don't always evolve at the same pace, and that's completely fine as long as there is transparency about where you are now. So think about where do you want to be strategically? Where are you now in terms of your operations? And that gap is what we want to bridge by building your roadmap. So to map your positioning in terms of your actions and disclosure maturity, we recommend organizations start with conducting a gap analysis exercise. This is what it can look like in practice, which is a simplified example of a transition plan maturity assessment. It looks at the core elements across the core dimensions, and it can be a structured way to assess for your readiness and identify gaps for where your business is today versus where it needs to be to prepare for your transition plan. And what the gap analysis can help is to pinpoint the priority areas and identify any additional supporting activities that can be useful to inform your subsequent steps of planning and also engagement. So moving from ambition to execution requires more than just targets or aspirations. Strong governance is what really underpins everything and what really transforms climate strategy into enterprise strategy. Because let's face it, no matter how well defined your climate ambition can be, it needs the right structures, the right climate expertise, and accountability mechanisms to be in place in order to turn that into action. So what we're talking about here is looking at board level accountability and oversight. So clear ownership by senior executive roles, having climate expertise in decision-making forums, and integration of climate and sustainability into incentives, risk management, and investment decisions. What we're increasingly also seeing is that boards are linking climate KPIs to executive pay. So this is something that we are increasingly seeing, because the fact is that if no one is accountable, no one acts. So the bottom line is that a credible transition strategy really needs credible oversight, and governance is where this credibility is really earned.
Brilliant. I'll jump back in here to go through step 2, which is all about assessing your risks and opportunities, and most importantly, integrating them into your transition strategy. It's not just about reporting what you see, but also how you use it to define your low carbon pathway. And when it comes to risk, we need to take a broad approach to also identify wider risks that may impact a successful transition pathway. I'm not going to go into too much detail in terms of the climate-related risks. Obviously, within the UK, that's been mandated for some time. But of course, we have the key categories of physical risk, transition risk. More importantly, we need to consider these broader risks, which is nature-related risks. So they're often overlooked. And at times it can be more challenging because unlike climate, there's not just one indicator, i.e. emissions, it's much broader in terms of the indicators of what nature best practice and protection looks like. And then finally, we need to think about social and labour risks. And this links back to our earlier point on a just transition. So failing to plan for workforce and community impacts creates not only equity concerns, but a real business risk. And so each of these elements need to feed into your transition plan. If we don't understand this full risk landscape, we risk building strategies that aren't resilient and ultimately are not going to be deliverable. And most importantly, it's not just about risk. Transition planning is also a platform for opportunities. Within our clients, we increasingly see companies unlock innovation, competitive advantage through climate. Again, I won't go into all of the categories here because, of course, this is quite fundamental to some of our climate-related financial disclosures in the UK, but more than happy to follow up if you have any queries after this webinar. But we have low carbon efficiency, low carbon innovation, sort of new products, digitization, material substitution. These aren't just side benefits, they're potential growth levers. We also have market access, green procurement criteria, access to capital, essentially a chance for brand differentiation. And what filters into all of this is supply chain resiliency. And then again, overlaid on all of this is your reputational leadership. So talent, attraction, retention, a desire for purpose, and of course, investor confidence, improved ratings that come alongside. And within all of these opportunities, there is immense potential to reduce costs and create value. And for some businesses, there's also a role for quantifying avoided emissions. You may have sometimes heard those referred to as Scope 4 emissions. We've done a webinar on that in the past, although it doesn't sit in the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. But so while it's not part of formal reporting standards, it's increasingly relevant to internal planning, investor storytelling, to essentially demonstrate climate-related opportunities and solutions for your business. And then finally, within this risk section, how do you operationalize all of this? Your risk evaluation should extend across your value chain, and the goal should be to embed this within your strategy and quantify the financial impact. A key business activity is to determine the risks and opportunities, and that will include mapping exposures across your value chain, understanding what's material, where do the hotspots sit, and then currently within the UK, the expectation is for qualitative scenario analysis. But if you're really going to operationalize this within your transition plan and have a clear understanding of those transition levers, you do need to move towards quantitative scenario analysis. So that's both measuring and tracking and defining KPIs for the financial impact. You'll also need a mitigation and adaptation roadmap, and that's going to be, of course, your core resiliency plan, and that data will ideally feed into your CapEx planning, potentially exploring the role of internal carbon pricing as a means to secure commitments, and we'll come on to financing tools later on in the webinar. And what we see, essentially, the future is uncertain, but we need to be developing clear monitoring and readjustment processes so that any plan that you develop can continually update, adjust, and reflect what is a changing reality in our external world.
So having looked at the risks, opportunities linked to your business and transition, we arrive at step 3. So this is looking at defining low carbon pathways. And it's really the heart of your transition plan. It's where strategy meets action. So over the next few slides, we'll break that down and look at what a strong decarbonization pathway looks like. The climate transition can be understood in 3 interconnected stages. We prioritize, of course, reduction of emissions from your direct operations, but also tackling those upstream and downstream value chain emissions. We then look at neutralizing the residual emissions only after all abatement has been maximized through the use of high quality offset removals. And then lastly, and ultimately, the aim is to transition to a climate optimized business model. So this is where your operations, your investments, and your strategies are aligned in a net zero climate resilient future. So when looking at how the business will decarbonize in practice, we start with good data and aim to end with a clear route to action. This means including some of these elements on these slides. Well, ideally all the elements on this slide. So we want to have a clearly defined baseline, including your scope 1, 2, and 3, but also possibly understanding as well if you have any avoided emissions linked to your operations. We want science-aligned time-bound targets, as well as a clear view of what sort of decarbonization levers may be available to your business. We want an abatement potential assessment, potentially aligning it with sectoral scenarios and understanding a financing plan that backs up your ambition. And lastly, of course, a robust strategy for offsetting the residual emissions. The emissions mitigation hierarchy can be a foundational framework where organizations can look to help focus on actions that drive the most meaningful impact. Now, in reality, some of these actions, especially the first 4 of avoidance, reduction, replacement, and transformation, can happen in parallel or overlap, depending on where your organization is in terms of your technology readiness, your structure, and operational context. Ideally, businesses do focus on avoiding emissions entirely, so eliminating them at the source where possible, and then look to reduce emissions through efficiency improvements and operational changes. So these are the types of levers which are normally scalable and have fast return on investment. So examples are retrofits and energy efficiency measures. Then we want to look to switch to low carbon alternatives, so looking into things like renewables and electrification. And then one important aspect of this is the transformation piece. And what we're talking about when we say transformation is transforming your business model and your supply chain. So often these can look like longer term changes, which are essential for tackling your scope 3 value chain emissions. And this is where you can possibly unlock systemic decarbonization through engagement and collaboration. And then, of course, lastly, offsets should be reserved and used only after all the other options have been pursued. So on this slide, we bring together 2 tools to help you understand how we can systematically assess and prioritize your identified emission reduction options and levers. On the top, we have what's called a marginal abatement cost curve, or MACC. And on the bottom, we have a scoring framework, which organizations can use to evaluate the decarbonization levers that goes beyond just looking at costs. So MACC on the top is a fairly structured process. You define your scope, identify your decarbonization options, quantify your emissions reduction potential and costs, and then rank them from the most to least cost effective. The result is this visual curve, like the one that's shown on the top right-hand side. And what you often see is that some initiatives might have negative costs, which mean they help you save money while reducing emissions, while others can drive reductions but require capital over time. But of course, costs and carbon alone don't tell the full story. So that's where the broader scoring framework comes in. So when we work with clients to assess the levers, we also consider things like feasibility. So how complex is the lever to actually implement? What extent is it to which some government policies or incentives may support or inhibit these initiatives? Does it make financial sense in terms of payback period, and how quickly can benefits be realized over which timeframes. And also critically, factors like the co-benefits, social impact, and strategic fit are also key considerations that organizations should take into consideration. And so by combining all these factors into a weighted scoring framework, this can allow for more informed, evidence-based sequencing of initiatives. A similar framework can potentially be deployed as well to address avoided emissions, for example. Now, it's important to note that while this methodology and framework can be consistent, the scoring matrix is, of course, not a one-size-fits-all, as each organization is different in terms of emissions profile and operational constraints. So on this slide, we have a quick illustrative example of what a decarbonization pathway can look like. Again, it's just an example, but what matters here is sequencing. So the prioritization of low cost, high impact actions in the near term, while reserving some of the more complex or capital intensive solutions planned out and embedded into the planning and investment cycles, possibly the mid to long term. So the actual pathway will, of course, differ based on your sector, but the underlying principle is consistent to maximize the feasible emission reductions first before turning to offsets for hard to abate residuals. So that brings me to the next slide here, where we talk about offsets themselves. I won't go much into detail, but there are the two main types to consider. We have avoidance offsets, which are offsets on projects that prevent future emissions from occurring. And then we have removal offsets. So these are offsets that directly remove or capture carbon from the atmosphere. Removal offsets are typically seen as more credible and can be nature-based or based on technological solutions, especially in the context of long-term science-based targets. However, it is important to address the risks around additionality and permanence and leakage, which is why, so on the right-hand side, we've listed down a number of offset certification standards that can be seen as best practice to ensure that offsets sourced are of high quality. So in order to mitigate the risk of the low quality offsets, what we recommend companies doing is to prioritize credibility. And for that, we look at some of the leading standards that are in the market now. So we have the Voluntary Carbon Markets Initiatives, the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative, so VCMI, which provides a guidance for companies that are aiming to make credible, transparent claims, which includes some of the foundational criteria for how companies should communicate and use offsets are listed on the top here. And complementing this, and which is also referred in the VCMI standard, is the ICVCM carbon principles. So this covers issues like additionality, permanence mentioned before, ensuring there's no double counting, and ensuring sustainable development impacts. So together, companies should use these criteria as somewhat like a checklist to help demonstrate integrity in carbon credit use. So lastly, decarbonization isn't just a technical challenge, it's also a social one. So as we phase out our emissions intensive practices and shift to low carbon ones, what we want to do is to ensure that we're also making it inclusive for the people as we do so. So a truly just transition also means designing strategies that uplift workers, protect communities, and create new opportunities across the value chain. And so it's important to really understand how your climate actions can also affect these stakeholders. So some questions to think about are, how will changes in your operations affect your workforce? Is there any support in place that your company may have for reskilling or redeployment? Are communities or vulnerable regions being disproportionately impacted? Or how can we make sure that low carbon products and services are affordable? So building these questions into your transition planning process can help you avoid unintended consequences and ultimately reduces resistance, because a transition that's not just technically feasible, but also socially viable is one that is more likely to succeed.
Perfect. That brings us to the next step of the roadmap, the stakeholder engagement, because of course a lot of different stakeholders are involved when we're looking at transition plans. We have listed the main ones here. You look at internal ones within your company, of course, external ones, the internal including definitely your highest governance board in your company, finance, risk, compliance, sustainability teams, teams across operations, HR for the employee part, and so on. And then on the external ones, we of course look at investors, customers, potential business partners, policymakers, suppliers as well, communities, NGOs, all dependent, of course, also on the sector you are in. But on the right-hand side, we see some transition strategy good practice indicators for engagement. And of course, the engagement should be done as mutual learning, that you understand the requirements from your customers, the requirements from finance internally, the requirements of your employees, and so on. We wanted to point of course, the engagement with investors on climate plan assumptions, targets, and trade-offs. We come to the finance section in a moment, but of course, a transition will likely require investment. So important to engage with your investors early on the plans you are having. Collaboration with suppliers, crucial to meet any Scope 3 related goals, and can also be seen as a driver for innovation for lower carbon products or services. Policy engagement, there's actually in the draft of the SBTi updated standard, or the draft standard at the moment, they point out that all the policy engagement companies will conduct that have set a net zero target with SBTi needs to be aligned with the Paris Agreement and aligned with a net zero objective, of course, here. Upskilling and engaging employees, supporting them in understanding what the transition plan means for the companies, for their roles, and so on, is also an important part to, as Yinmui mentioned, fulfill the requirements for a just transition. And of course, all the stakeholder engagement should lead to collected feedback that will be used to integrate it into any plan updates and into any potential governance process updates.
Brilliant. Now we're on to step 5, which is finance planning and alignment. And the main motivation for this is if your net zero strategy isn't funded, it's simply a wish list. What we want to ensure is that we're bringing the finance team to the table, not just within the sustainability department. So what does good look like when financing your transition? And I've got here on this very busy slide, I won't go through all of the contents, essentially those 5 pillars on integrating and planning for finance. So the first pillar is embedding climate into your financial planning. You want to link your CapEx, OpEx directly to your net zero roadmap. Ideally, apply internal carbon pricing, and of course, make any assumptions visible and decision useful. You also need to align funding with your transition strategy. You need to know what it costs. You need to identify any funding gaps and disclose how you're financing the plan. You also need to ensure you're financing a just, fair transition. There should be funding set aside to support any workforce change, any supplier adaptation, remediate any potential local impacts. Finally, on step 4, you want to link performance to climate delivery. And Yinmui spoke about this earlier, but essentially we want to track how your spending aligns with your climate goals. We want to tie that progress to executive incentives, not just in the short term, but also in the longer term. And then finally, disclose climate-related financials. And that's a theme throughout all of this webinar, which is the transparent reporting and the need to do so. And the goal of this is to build trust and investor confidence. And as you can see up here within the table, we've kind of mapped out some of those key elements of where they sit within those frameworks. And of course, it's across the board, essentially. So within the Transition Plan Task Force, IFRS S2, which Victoria mentioned hot off the press, I think at 1 o'clock today, was released by the UK government with only 6 minor amendments. So essentially that's going to be required in the future within the UK. And then of course, it's been rolled out within CDP on a voluntary basis for a number of years. And then when we get those principles in place, it's then all about selecting the right tools to operationalize your plan. Again, I won't go into all of these in detail. We're looking at CapEx realignment, internal carbon pricing, potentially green bonds, sustainability-linked loans, climate budgeting, and incorporating that into your budget cycles, and a fund for just transition. And then, what tools and mechanisms you put in place will vary depending on your sector, your size, your financing structure, but the principle will remain the same. It's not just a support function, your financial planning for the transition, it's going to be central to your transition strategy. And of course, if it's not all aligned within your climate ambition, you're unlikely to succeed on your goal. So this is where your strategy will become real. And if we move on to a reality check, we know that the cost of the climate transition is immense. It's expected to exceed 125 trillion by 2050. And there's a huge gap between ambition and capital deployment. We've got the World Economic Forum 2025 data showing that there's still a lag within transition readiness, especially within regulation, infrastructure, and investment. And if we look at the recent CDP analysis, it's found that many companies, while they may have very strong governance and risk management, only 45% of those surveyed companies responding have a transition plan in place. And if we take that one step further in terms of the financial planning, even fewer, 9%, show alignment between their strategy and the actual capital expenditure. And so this message is simple. We need to back ambition by investment. If the money isn't flowing, it's very unlikely that the transition will follow and succeed.
And that brings us to our final step in the roadmap. So we covered ambition, pathways, stakeholder engagement, and finance. And now we are turning to the final piece of the puzzle, tracking and reporting. So when we look at tracking first, we have a couple of points here. So of course, to stay on track, you need to track not just long-term goals, but near-term and mid-term milestones and report on them to actually get to the long-term net zero goal. This means embedding KPIs directly into your business processes, your governance cycles, and your performance reviews. The best track systems are the ones that surface gaps early, so you can course correct before targets are missed and adapt. We are also recommending making tracking useful, so make it not just for reporting, but use it for decision-making, use it to embed it into your strategy. Because the internal teams, they need insights, they not just need data, but also what follows based on this data, what decisions can be taken based on the data. And for external stakeholders, of course, they need trust, and that is not just a table of numbers. Trust is, of course, built with transparent reporting over years. On the right-hand side, we have included some key considerations when evaluating tech or platforms, because, of course, we recognize that there have been huge developments in the tech area into ESG reporting platforms. We wanted to highlight a few points because there's no one platform available yet that would fit everyone. Of course, the biggest part, or one of the biggest parts we see is in importance here, is the integration of the capabilities within your existing systems and data sources, so that your existing software can feed into the ESG software to allow for accurate data security, of course, privacy controls, also important points here. Adaptability to the new regulations in the evolving disclosure standards, because as I earlier mentioned, you could see how those are fast developing and changing. So that's an important consideration, besides, of course, cost effectiveness and customization here. Moving on to effective reporting, just want to mention a couple of points here as we are close to our deadline here, our timeline. Effective reporting, of course, is not just a tick box exercise. It's a trust building tool. It's about transparency, as I mentioned before. It will tell your stakeholders, we have a plan, we are delivering, we are accountable. So even, I think we recently spoke to companies that failed to deliver on their targets, on their near-term targets, but they knew exactly why and exactly what they can change. So it's important to be transparent there. We have listed here 6 main points to get it right: the materiality and relevancy, of course, plan structure and governance, listing all your assumptions, part of transparency, and also the credibility of those assumptions, the financial integration, a more and more increasingly important point in disclosure requirements as well, when we look at IFRS standards, for example. And consistency in your reporting. And with this, we finish the roadmap part of our webinar today. And I hand it over to Helena for the last part.
Brilliant. It looks like we are right on time. We might have time for 1 or 2 questions. We tried to answer some in the chat, but do reach out via email. We'll pop our emails on the follow-up should we not be able to get to your question. In terms of key takeaways, the main thing that we want you to leave with is that transition planning, it's your strategy in action. It's not a side project, it is your business strategy. We're just approaching it with a climate lens. What we've seen is that credible plans connect ambition to delivery. They're grounded in finance, good governance, and clear pathways. Risk and opportunity insights, they need to shape that roadmap. And this is how you're going to stay resilient amid many unexpected changes or political standpoints. And then stakeholder engagement, it's non-negotiable. It needs to be integrated. We need to go all the way up from your employees to your investors to external, your affected stakeholders. We need that alignment to build trust and succeed on the plan and the strategy that you developed. We need to make sure that your suppliers can deliver on those particular decarbonisation goals you've set, and you're really thinking about that across all of your value chain. Next, we see tracking and reporting. It's not just about compliance. They enable learning, iteration, and ideally a course correction on strategic decision making if you don't get it right in the beginning. And finally, and hopefully this is something that we have embedded throughout the webinar, which is a just transition is absolutely necessary. What is going to make your transition plan durable, equitable, able to invest in is making sure that it's fair and leaving no one behind. I'm mindful we are right on time. I want to thank everyone for joining us. Unfortunately, we don't have any time for questions, but we'll have a log of those so that we can reach out to you. I just want to say thank you again for joining us. Emails are on here. Please do reach out if you would like to continue the conversation. We'd love to discuss how Agenda can support your strategic and transition planning approach. Many thanks for your time today.